"Get out of my way!" he bellowed. He shoved a scion aside, knelt down, and took aim. A roaring pillar of plasma spat from the weapon's blunt muzzle, ionizing the air into a violent halo of blue. Antoniato hit the Helldrake square on the neck, and the superheated gas melted through its flesh metal, filling the hangar with a revolting stench. The Helldrake's head fell to the floor with a clang. Its limbs thrashed once, and it lay still. "Emp!" Lacrante began. A shock wave of energy blasted from the downed machine. Wicked faces leered in curls of blue flame. When it passed through Lacrante, he felt a part of his soul blacken. In the smoke of the downed Helldrake, the outline of a raging figure appeared, mouth wide and screaming. There was a flash of light. A force knocked Lacrante off his feet, and the figure vanished. The wail of klaxons and shouts of the damaged control teams seemed nothing compared to the screams of the beast machine. Lacrante lay stunned. It was Rostov himself who held out a hand to help him up. Lacrante took it. "Thank you, my lord." "Rostov will suffice," said the Inquisitor. "What was that?" Rostov looked at the dead craft. "A demon engine. Technology married with sorcery. Its machine spirit replaced by the soul of a neverborn," said Rostov. He looked at Lacrante with his cool blue eyes. "Not so long ago, I would have had to kill you after telling you that. Be thankful you're in a new world now. Doors have opened to you that were closed before." Rostov left him with no further explanation, going to the Tempestus scions and summoning their sergeant. Lacrante looked around for Antoniato and found him on his knees nearby, loudly thanking the Emperor, while Chilka rubbed his back with 3 of her hands. He scowled at Lacrante, daring him to comment. "I hate flying," he said.
"You're alive, aren't you?" Chilka said. "Stop whining."
Lacrante took a breath and steeled himself to address the small Xenos. I must thank you." Chilka wrinkled her flat nose and showed off a double row of wide teeth.
"Never thought you'd be saying that to a Xenos, did you?"
"I've never met one," he admitted.
"You wouldn't have. Most of your kind would kill me on sight. You would have too, if it weren't for Rostov. You're not a nice species."
"I'm sorry."
"Save it, human," she said. "We're not out of danger yet."
The St. Aster shook under a heavy impact.
"See,"
she said with a smile.
"We're probably all still going to die."
"Madam Commodore, Inquisitor Rostov is aboard," Fionnuala shouted. A cheer went up, but it was ragged and lost to the roar of atmosphere dragging at the ship's exterior. The Chaos Cruiser was hard on their stern, less than 6 miles behind, closer than point-blank range for ships of that size. It was firing on them, but the turbulent electromagnetic field wake generated by the St. Aster's engines deflected the worst of the lance fire, and the enemy could not bring its solid-shot broadsides to bear. Fionnuala checked their status again. The other ship outgunned them. In the void, it would destroy them. "Shall I give the order to ascend?" she shouted. Athagay sat tensely, eyes narrowed, concentrating on every aspect of her ship's operation. "No. Give me the time until we're trapped in the gravity well," she demanded. 6 seconds, responded one of her lieutenants. "We should fire the ventral thrust now and get out of this dive," said Fionnuala. "Wait!" Athagay's fingers danced over the air. The haptic glove manipulated a display only she could see through her eyepiece. Her fingers stopped. She stared at something intently. The St. Aster screamed. Metal groaned from every quarter as the forces of air resistance and gravity fought her mass. Every tactical display was a mass of static and flickering ghost returns. The high peeping of alarms warning of failing integrity fields rang out from every quarter. The temperature inside the command deck was climbing fast. The ship shook, and Fionnuala had to stop herself from grabbing onto the dais rail in fear. "Madam Commodore!" she shouted. Athagay held up a single finger. "Not yet," she said. She dropped her hand. "Now!" Fionnuala stabbed a Vox button. "Helm, engage all ventral thrusters. Full burn immediately. Execute," she shouted. Her words were a panicked rush. The helmsmen were ready for the order and reacted instantly. The ship rumbled. More alarms rang, and there was a sudden upthrust that punched into the crew and made them stagger. Shuddering so hard it made Fionnuala's vision blur, the St. Aster's prow pitched upwards. "Increase main engines to maximum output," Athagay demanded. Again the crew reacted quickly, and another forceful blow hit them as the engines vented all the thrust they had. The stress on the vessel was immense. Its spine flexed, decking rumpled not far from the commandeers, and steam gushed from a broken pipe beneath the floor. Rivets popped out of the wall like bullets, injuring the crew. A bronze statue of the ship's first captain fell from its perch high up in the vaulting and smashed itself flat upon a navigation desk, killing the 3 ensigns manning the machines there. Fire roared from a pressure tube near the servitor choirs, but slowly, the St. Aster rose. Proximity alarms added themselves to the clamour of terrified machine spirits. Fionnuala called up her TrueVid aft view. Through the glare of superheated air, plasma exhaust and tortured void shielding, she saw the pursuing ship slip past their stern, barely half a mile away. The vile decorations encrusting its defiled hull were visible through the heat smear, and its spinal weapons blazed red at the St. Aster. They were within each other's shielding, and the guns hit home. A single lance with sufficient elevation to track the Imperial ship punched through the St. Aster's armour. More alarms shrilled. The damaged section was flushed out by raging atmosphere. Fionnuala thought they would be torn to pieces. The St. Aster bumped hard to one side, but the hull held, and her course stayed true. The red of abused sky was replaced by the sparkle flash of war-racked space. The shaking subsided. The tactical displays filled once more with information on the wider battle as the ship's auguries regained their sight. In the rear view, she watched the enemy ship continue its dive, its greater mass dooming it to a fiery death. As she watched, its shields gave out, and a chunk of its superstructure was ripped free. She keyed the view off. The St. Aster was racing over the planet. Her flotilla was splitting in loose formation, engines at full burn, fleeing the Blood King. Fionnuala began to collate their losses. 2 ships floated, crippled. The debris hinted at more destroyed. Blood King continued its rampage across the centre of the withdrawing Imperial ships. The Chaos Fleet had suffered casualties as a result of its impetuousness, but the Imperial sphere formation had fragmented, and the Imperials could not bring their guns to bear on their enemy. On the hololith showing the battlesphere, ships blinked as boarding pods were launched. Fionnuala watched as stragglers were swarmed and overwhelmed, while their sisters were kept from responding by punishing fusillades from the Blood King. The ship continued to increase its speed. Inertial dampeners could only take so much of the pressure from the constant acceleration, and the weight of it pushed hard against them all. The battlesphere receded behind them, the world shrinking with increasing rapidity, until it was a ball garlanded by blinks and stuttering lights. The fleeing Imperial ships were a scattering of bright dots across the blackness. Only time would tell how many vessels and men had been saved. A flash sheeted across the void as a ship's reactor went nova. Then the battle was behind them, and the oculus showed only the wide-open expanse of infinity ahead. The St. Aster headed out into the deep void, leaving Fomor 3 to the growing warp rift and the bloody mercies of chaos. A vox chime drew Fionnuala's attention from her screens. "This is Inquisitor Rostov. Allow me to access your astropaths. I must commune with Terra immediately." Chapter 14. Into the Void. The Scrutiny of Space Marines. Rivalries Kindled. Fabian was going into the void, and he wasn't sure he was happy about that. 2 more of Guilliman's initial Historitors had been recruited by then and went with him. The others were an off-world aristocrat named Devon Mudire and a Martian priestess by the name of Solana. All of them were to accompany Guilliman's party off Terra. Mudire was of such a rarefied social class he could hardly speak to Fabian. Solana, on the other hand, was friendly. "That is the sound of the primary engine pre-flight warm-up sequence engaging," she explained, as Fabian's eyes darted around the hold of the transport. They were being conveyed in a large passenger shuttle, holding 36 other standard or nearly standard humans from various branches of the Imperial state. Fabian thought that he should have been more impressed by his inclusion. On board were some of the most influential people in the galaxy. Or rather, he corrected himself, the servants of some of the most influential people in the galaxy. The actual lords were flying in their own craft. However, his excitement and sense of history were both overshadowed by growing fear. At the last moment, his mind had decided it really didn't like the idea of leaving Terra and going into the naked void at all. The Space Marine sent to keep an eye on the passengers didn't help. The seats were too small for him, so he stood, fully armoured, with his back to the 3 Historitors in the centre of the ship. His armour was a brilliant yellow, Gaudy, even in the dim lighting of the transit cabin. He was enormous, not as big as the Primarch, but there was a greater sense of threat from him, like he could go from total stillness to murderous violence at a moment's notice. He radiated danger as much as his reactor pack radiated heat. Fabian tugged at the collar of his new uniform. It was too tight and too itchy. "Does he have to just stand there?" whispered Fabian to his new colleagues. "It's so intimidating." "That's the whole point," said Mudaya airily. He watched his golden autoquill compile notes on his data slate and didn't look up. "He's Adeptus Astartes. He's supposed to be intimidating. But he's blocking the aisle. What if there were an accident?" Mudaya gave him a withering look. "There will not be an accident," said Solana cheerily. "Not if the correct prayers have been undertaken." She smiled. "As well as regular maintenance, of course. Ships of this type and age have a very good accident record, as long as there's regular maintenance." "And if there's not regular maintenance?" said Fabian. "There will not be an accident," said Solana again, in exactly the same bright tone she'd used before. "Oh, throne," said Fabian. He gripped the armrests and pushed himself back into the padding of the seat. "Anyone would think you had never been on a post-orbital flight," said Mudaya. "I haven't been on any kind of flight," he snapped. The last few weeks had been full of firsts. In most ways, his life had taken a turn for the better. The food he was given was unlike anything he'd eaten before. Real fruit, real vegetables, generous portions of synth meat. He had been given a full medical appraisal, which culminated in a lot of red ink on his Medicaid chart, a stringent program of exercise he was not enjoying, and enough medicaments to floor an amble. The first time he took a pulse shower was like dying and ascending to some pagan paradise. Gunther had insisted he use it, having made unkind comments about his odour. Reluctant at first, for it seemed so wasteful of water, he couldn't stay out of it now. Then there was the library. He'd had time to visit precisely once, but the books there had amazed him. He had access to the Historitus' small staff, of whom Rasilisu was bizarrely jealous. So he didn't like having to wear trousers instead of his comfortable robes, and the threat of imminent death hanging over him took the shine off the opulence that surrounded him, but he would be a fool not to be grateful. He'd been taken from obscurity and elevated to the heights of power. Culture shock was inevitable. "What do we expect of this demonstration?" said Fabian, to take his mind off the impending flight. "Nobody knows," said Solana. "It will be impressive, though, if Call's prior achievements are indicative." She was not what Fabian expected from a tech priest, though she wasn't a priest, as she gently pointed out several times. She was very thin. Her skull was sharp beneath her skin, and that made her eyes appear very large. They were silvered with internal augmentations, making them even more prominent. In the left of her skull was a large chrome assembly with a neat little port. Her memcore, she'd explained. A tattoo of the cog and skull of the Machina Opus occupied the spot on the opposite side of her head. But she didn't spout on about her shocking god or making small talk with the hardware, like he'd assumed Mechanicus personnel would. "And Call? What's he like? Who is he?" Solana's eyes lit up. "Who is he?" she said, and laughed. "He is the great Call, the finest Archmagos alive. They call him the prime conduit of the Omnissiah. His achievements are legendary. It is rumoured he has lived for 10,000 years, and that he has been responsible for some of our greatest triumphs. He worked on the Space Marine program with the Emperor himself. He fought during the Great Heresy War. He unlocked the tech vaults of the Kuvatna and reactivated the Death Moon of Rhesus. They say he located the Spirit of Eternity and bested its Silica Animus in a game of wits." "Then why have I never heard of him?" said Fabian, who had never heard of any of the other things either. She shrugged. "His works are of interest to my people. I don't see how they would come to the attention of yours. But he is marvellous. I do hope we can meet him. I have so many questions." "There is the alternative point of view, that he is a dangerous, maladjusted, power-hungry heretic," said Mudaya carefully. "Only some call him the prime conduit of the Omnissiah. He has a lot of less flattering names as well. It all depends on who you ask." He gave them a thin smile. "You really should have done the reading before we left, Sir Gelfrain." Mudaya managed to make the honorific sound like an insult. "Seeing as I've been run from pillar to post by our new masters," Fabian said, "I couldn't really find the time. Forgive me." "I'd learn to find it." Mudaya made a brightly glowing mark with his quill on the screen of his slate. "You don't want to end up like Thenes." "Who's Thenes?" Solana looked away. "He's nobody now, which is rather my point," said Mudaya. "You are overly fond of the word point," said Fabian. "If we're to be writing histories, I'd suggest you develop a broader vocabulary." "Oh, throne!" The engines burst into full-throated life. No amount of kinetic dampening and solid cushions could cut out all the vibrations. The shuttle trembled as it lifted up slowly, like it too were frightened of venturing into the void. "Oh, throne! Oh, throne! Oh, throne! Oh, throne!" said Fabian. The engines roared. A great weight pressed onto Fabian's chest, so that he thought he might pass out. Solana gripped his hand in hers and smiled. Mudaya shook his head and settled back. "Emperor! Oh, my Emperor! I don't want to die!" Fabian shouted. The Space Marine turned to look at him. Fabian regretted speaking. The wait lasted a few minutes. The engine roar cut out, and the weight left him. "We have stopped accelerating," said Solana. "We are now in the void. See? That wasn't so bad, was it?" She squeezed his hand and let it go. Mudaya went back to his work. Fabian lifted his hand. It was strangely weightless and stayed where it was. "No gravtech," Solana said, half to herself. "They must be rationing energy, saving fuel. The Crusade is taking everything." She looked towards the blank walls of the shuttle. "Imagine what is going on out there. The might of dozens of star systems all gathered together in one place. Mankind's greatest army in millennia. There must be thousands of ships out there, and we're among them, the combined might of Terra and Mars." Mudaya tilted his head. "A pity they didn't send us up in a ship with windows to see out of, then. A bit of an oversight, considering our role." "I don't feel very—" Fabian hiccuped. His hand shot up to his mouth. "You're not going to vomit, are you?" said Mudaya. Fabian nodded, distraught. His cheeks bulged. Solana retrieved a pouch from under the seating and passed it to him. Fabian took it gratefully and was noisily sick. "Oh, it appears you are," said Mudaya. He pulled the bag away from his mouth. A bead of vomit floated past his face. He tried to catch it, swatting it with his hand into a dozen tiny bubbles. The Space Marine turned round further to look at him, exposing his nameplate. Fabian felt worse knowing the Astartes' name. It brought home the fact that there was a man in there, judging him, and he lowered his gaze back to the pouch. Even it was richly made. He had come from one world and gone into another without moving more than 100 miles from where he was born. He wretchedly wondered how many Imperiums there were, nestling blindly against each other. He wondered if any of them were remotely fair. He was loudly sick again. My, Fabian," said Mudaya, eyes still on his slate. "You really are covering yourself in glory." Chapter 15. Zarquasitor, Aquila Resplendum, a Primarch's Project. Messinius stood watch upon the secondary command deck of Guilliman's lander, the Aquila Resplendum. Gifted to the Primarch by the Adeptus Custodes, the ship was fashioned in the shape of a great double-headed eagle and had a command deck in each of the heads, jutting from the tall body. Spread wings incorporated engine units. Its landing claws, currently retracted against the gold-feathered belly, were made to look like broad talons. Messinius found it gaudy, but beneath the layers of decoration was a strong ship, powerfully fast, with an impressive armament. It was fit for the Primarch, he thought, for all those traits were necessary. The heavens between Luna and Terra were full of ships, and threats could come from anywhere. The deck oculus was a 4-foot-high slit wrapped around the eagle's face, narrowing a little to the front, where the face's brows drew in judgmentally over its hooked beak. From outside, the windows made eyes, but the view was less restrictive than the exterior suggested, providing Messinius with a clear view of the mustering fleets of Primus and Quartus. Buoys lined clear paths through the mass of ships, directing traffic through the throng. He had never seen so many vessels in one place at one time, though he had lived for centuries. Primus was the biggest of the fleets currently gathering in the Sol system, with nearly 200 ships of war of all sizes. Quartus was smaller, and only a portion of it gathered directly at Terra, but even that part was larger than most sector battle fleets. The warships were attended by hundreds of tenders, salvage vessels, scout craft, and rogue trader ships, and there were thousands of transporters for the armies they would take to liberate Imperium Sanctus. This was only the beginning, since the fleets would get bigger as they sailed, gathering to themselves part of the Martian Basilicon Astra before they left Sol, and vessels to take Mechanicus ground forces from Skitarii clade ships up to Titan conveyors. There would be Chartist ships following in the Warfleet's wake to re-establish Imperium Sanctus's broken trade networks, and the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, whose recommencing of the Psyker Tithe grew more urgent with every passing day. What was happening throughout the Sol system was the greatest military muster since the Great Crusade, but it was only a part of the greater whole, for Guilliman's plan was audacious. All across the Imperium, similar gatherings were underway, vast movements of troops and assets undertaken despite war and compromised communications. Messinius was witnessing part of the Emperor's plan reborn. This was the work of one Primarch. What would 18 have done? The Indomitus Crusade was too big to comprehend. The forces on display at Terra were too much to take in. There were ships in every direction, the great battleships and heavy cruisers like queens in social insect hives, served by endless lines of lesser craft, moving to and from Luna and the Throne World. He saw the Excelsior Cruor, command craft of the Lord High Admiral of the Navy, Lady Merelda Pereth, surrounded by its own escorts, a fleet in its own right standing sentinel over Terra's northern polar orbits. Not far from it was the Dawn of Fire, which would serve as the Primarch's flagship. Both were immense, miles long, but in this city made of ships, tiny districts only. Terra heaved with insurrection. Still, the Primarch managed to command this emptying of worlds. Guilliman's success was Messinius's problem. Ships were arriving from the system's edge all the time. The largest had crews tens of thousands strong. The smallest were insignificant enough to evade detection. Any one of them could contain a threat to his lord. It only took one man on one ship in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the Indomitus Crusade would be strangled at birth. Messinius's mind operated at capacity, occupied by dozens of streams of information. Men and women handed him data slates to check. Audex and vid feeds piped directly into his sensorium. Data screeds scrolled endlessly down his helm plate. The secondary flight deck was occupied by men and women of the Officio Logisticarum under his command, and there were several Space Marines. Everyone on that deck was concerned solely with the Primarch's security. All of them needed to speak to him. Security was tight. Between the Aquila Resplendum and the barks of lordly Terrans flew 4 more transports, each one full of human stormtroopers and more Adeptus Astartes. Unwavering flights of Space Marine attack craft flew in escort around it. Adeptus Custodes accompanied Guilliman wherever he went. As preparations for the fleet's departure increased in tempo, security arrangements for the Primarch were becoming more difficult. According to agents from various Imperial Adepta, the deposed High Lords could not be trusted, and Messinius had his doubts about some of those currently in office, with worrying reports particularly coming from Cancellarius Anna Mirza Jek's office. There were parties across the Imperium who offered danger to the returned Primarch. That left out Xenos agents and those working for the great enemy, whether willingly or not, for there were 100 ways a man's will might be subverted. Although few beings in all the galaxy could stand against Rabute Guilliman in combat, he was not immortal. Today was a big risk. The Aquila Resplendum led a convoy of transports of even more jeweled ostentation than itself. Upon them were the great and good of Terra, including 8 of the 12 High Lords, and those who could not attend personally had sent their most trusted representatives. Here they all were, flying to visit one of the most dangerous men in the Imperium, the entire top echelon of the Imperial government. Absolute folly, thought Messinius, but Rabute Guilliman would not be dissuaded. He would have cause demonstration of whatever technology he brought to Terra. Battleships and cruisers fired low-power volleys from their energy weapons in salute. At that magnitude, coloured lights only, but a single good shot from a main armament, and the Primarch would die. Messinius tracked the power signatures of a dozen vessels simultaneously, alert for readings that indicated full charge emissions. Hundreds of fighter craft flew in display formations around and before the convoy. If one of those pilots decided to turn, the Primarch would die. They passed by the flanks of gargantuan bulk carriers, following void roads laid out by blinking beacons. If one of them was sabotaged, then the Primarch would die. None of these things happened. Beneath Messinius, stretching out in near infinite webs, were operatives of every kind from each of the Adeptus Terra. But he could not account for everything. He felt an unaccustomed tension that only grew as they passed through the endless ranks of voidcraft gathering for war. "My lord," the low voice of one of his crew interrupted his thoughts. He turned off his data flows so he could see her clearly. "Logister Rian," he said. "We are approaching our destination," she reported. "Thank you." She bowed, and Messinius took a few steps towards the Oculus. They were passing out of the shadow of a scarred battlecruiser undergoing a hurried refit. The light of Sol was rarely visible on Terra, but it shone pure in the void, as it had for time untold, and yellow light streamed through the windows. Ahead, in a clear area of space, was the largest ship of all, roughly ovoid in shape, covered all over with hangar slots, projecting instrument clusters and weapons blisters. Behind it, in perfect formation, were a dozen transports, shaped like ingots of metal. Messinius watched it grow larger. That ship could kill them all if it wished. It could do it while they were in space. It could be done while they were inside. Rabute Gilliman put an awful lot of trust in Belisarius' call. "Inform the Zarquasitor that we are on approach vector," he said. "Have them allocate a landing space. The Primarch comes." The Zarquasitor swelled until it was bigger even than the dirty orb of Terra and the sorrowful white round of Luna. Arch Mechanicus ships like this were rare, great relics from better times. Messinius had never seen one before. He had fought alongside Call during the Terran Crusade. The Magos had proved his worth time and again, but there was a tension between him and the Primarch. Call's armour of fate had saved Gilliman, bringing him back to life, and sustained him still, while Gilliman could command any man in the Imperium, and so both had holds over the other when neither liked to be restrained. Dissent was growing in the Adeptus Mechanicus at Call's influence. His methods were questionable. There would come a time when he and the Primarch did not see eye to eye, and what would he do then? They were directed towards a tall hangar gate low down on the Zarquasitor's belly. The Space Marine escort craft peeled away in perfect formation to await the Primarch's command. The Aquila Resplendum proceeded until the blue shimmer of the atmospheric field filled the forward view, the giant hangar it protected hazy beyond. A pale blue line, electrons thick, passed over the Eagle ship. Wings folded inwards. The landing gear swung down from the body, huge taloned feet opening, ready to brace the craft as it touched down. A violent outrushing of propellant gases burst from the landing jets, swallowing a wide expanse of the deck. Feet connected with the metal, shaking the hangar. The Eagle sank into itself, and before it had come to a full rest, the high chest opened. Burnished feathers parted in a razored fan, unlocking a gangway that folded down. Rabute Gilliman strode out as a delegation of Mechanicus priests assembled to meet him, the false Magos, ck3 at their head. Maldavar Colquan went at the Primarch's shoulder, his Oath brothers with him. 9 Space Marines followed them. Messinius watched them advance into the hangar, where they were greeted by a coterie of Magi. He half listened to their blandishments through shared helm feeds, more interested in the military hardware ranged about and the multiple threats it presented. The hangar ceiling was a forest of cranes, walkways and pipes, every shadow a hide for an assassin. The back wall was so far away, the figures moving around in the bright slit windows of the command stations there were grains of sand, their numbers and intent impossible to judge. Hundreds of vessels of all sizes stood in ranks on the plating. Thousands of servitors tended to them, the greatest concentrations around the incoming ships of the visitors, which were putting down in the center of the metal plain. Flocks of servo-skulls buzzed overhead, vying for space with larger cyber-constructs and autonomous drones. Many served a religious purpose, emitting soaring hymns from arrays of vox equipment or dropping plumes of incense in brightly colored smokes. A road led away from the landing field towards a set of armored gates big enough to accommodate battle titans. Thousands of cybernetically enhanced troops in the colors of Mars lined the way, increasing in size and power from man-sized hunters fidgeting on clicking metal legs to behemoths carrying arcane weaponry. The other ships continued to land, each taking to their own pads. Entourages marched out to each, carrying banners and accompanied by floating devices. Ramps opened. The most powerful people on Terra stepped out. The Grand Provost Marshal Avaliza Drachmar was escorted by 100 Adeptus Arbites judges dressed in gleaming black. Lucius Throde, the master of the Astronomicon, had a party only slightly smaller. Fewer armed men, more advisors and adjutants, many potent psychers. Violetta Roscavla emerged from another ship, leading dozens of high-ranking adepts of the Adeptus Administratum. On it went, each High Lord competing with the others through the size and splendor of their group. The dignitaries were directed away under the supervision of sophisticated servitor units in a pattern designed to acknowledge seniority and minimize offense. The escorts might have been tech magi on second inspection, but every being in Martian red was so heavily augmented it was hard to tell them apart from their mind-wiped slaves. Messinius watched until all the lords of the Imperium were aboard, knowing that there would be dozens of men like him watching at high alert, all thinking how insanely vulnerable this gathering of might was. Every one of the High 12, present or not, Trajan Valoris included, had sent a grand party, except one, and he worried Messinius most of all. Grandmaster Fadix of the Officio Assassinorum was already aboard, all alone. Messinius zoomed in with his autosensors and saw that Fadix was just there, watching everything carefully. The delegates gathered into a long procession. There was a place for Messinius by the Primarch's side.
"I am leaving," he informed his aides. "Continue scanning. Inform me of anything unusual, any anomaly, no matter how small. If Call's minions show any sign of blocking our auger soaks, I wish to know. If he has nothing to hide, then he has no business stopping us seeing what he has in this miniature forge world of his."
"Yes, my lord," his human followers said.
"Adeptus Astartes, make a perimeter around the ship. Be prepared to respond should we need to fight our way out of here. Be on your guard."
The Space Marines followed him down the ramp and fanned out. Messinius waited for the telltale chimes warning him of target locks, but the multiple weapons adorning the hangar hung inert in their mounts, and he felt a little easier. He was heading to his allotted place when he saw Gilliman's infant corps of Estoritors at the edge of the hangar, observing the view of the Crusade at anchor. Near the place, bright light shone from the containment field projectors to keep the air in. Nobody seemed to be taking them in hand, and with a growl he altered his course. They saw him coming and moved back from the edge. There was so much machinery at work. Metal surfaces responded to touch with an electric crackle. Sparks crawled over his boots when he stopped.
"Wait,"
he told them as they went to hurry by. He blocked their path, and they stopped. There were three, a rich-looking man, a young female Martian, and another male who had the pasty ill look of a Terran native.
"Where are you going?"
"To join the parade," said the rich man.
"At the back,"
said the other man nervously.
"You are not to follow the others in the servants' train," said Messinius. "You are of special status, beholden to the Primarch alone. You three are to follow the Primarch's party at a respectful distance, not close enough to be a nuisance to the Regent, near enough to hear what is said and to make records. What do you think you are doing?"
Messinius turned down his voxmeter, but the static burr it produced robbed his voice of human softness. He was frightening them. He could not believe they were so timid. This pet project of the Primarch's was ridiculous.
"If you see anything worth investigating, then investigate it. That is a priority order."
"A priority order," the Terran said. The captain's helm swiveled to look at him. The man cringed. "Of course, my lord," said the richer man, with a perfect courtly bow. "Hang on," said the Terran, finding some backbone. "You mean we are to snoop? That is not our role." Messinius stared at him some more.
"You are Fabian Gelfrain?"
he said. The man nodded. He did not cower this time.
"Your role is to do whatever the Primarch requires. If the Lord Gilliman thinks you should snoop, then you should snoop," said Messinius. "However, it is for neither you nor I to guess what is the Lord Primarch's mind. You are to make your own judgments. You have been given a great responsibility. Rise to it."
"Captain Messinius?" Fabian said, reading off the golden name scroll on his pauldron.
"That is my name and my rank."
Messinius stared down at the man. His red lenses glowed with the workings of his helm devices, but Fabian was looking through that, into his eyes. "We're chroniclers. We're not spies," said Fabian. "Be quiet, Fabian," said the rich man. He must be Mudir, thought Messinius. He was as arrogant as his files suggested. He had files on them all, but had paid them only cursory attention. The Historita project was far from his highest priority. "You are to do what you are commanded to do," said Messinius. "Then what are you commanding us to do exactly?" said Fabian. Messinius gave him another long stare. "You were recruited in part because of your imaginations. Use them," said Messinius eventually. "I recommend you move now, or you will be left behind. Do not disappoint the Primarch." He stalked away, his armored mass shaking the deck. "We won't," said Mudire to himself. "We remember Thanes." Messinius heard him mutter, and they started to bicker. He paid no more attention to them after that. The visiting Imperial party formed up into a long procession with the Primarch near its head. The line was over a mile long when assembled, and never narrower than 4 people abreast. Messinius had his Terran Crusade veterans stationed at regular intervals down the entire length of the group, ostensibly as an honor guard, but they had orders to be alert for suspicious activity. Guilliman was behind a block of Adeptus Mechanicus priests, bearing banners covered in esoteric marks. Colquan was at his left, ck3 at his right. Messinius took position in the file of Space Marine captains behind Guilliman. The few members of the Victrix Guard Guilliman had brought stood alongside in a file of their own. 2 groups of 5 to cover the Primarch's back. He stamped on his annoyance. He was glad that Guilliman had allowed him to bring the line troopers at least. As he waited for the rest of the groups to assemble, he ran tactical simulations in his helm, plotting possible routes of escape. Always escape, he thought. Never forward, never into battle. He yearned for the day they would depart on crusade and leave all the politicking behind. The lowing of a knight's war horn announced the beginning of Call's revelation. Others joined it, one at a time, until a dozen blared a mournful fanfare. The tech priests at the front of the procession began to sing an interweaving harmony of grating data songs. The larger war constructs stepped forward, causing Messinius's hand to clench, but they only lifted their weapons into an arch. The war horns cut out, and the giant gates leading to the Zarquisitor swung inwards. The Aquila Resplendum responded by auger scrying the revealed interior and set up a stream of scanning data directly to his sensorium. His armor's machine spirit sketched out a cartograph with a potential route. It was a long way. Massive energy signatures came from ahead. Heat blazed through the opening gates, and the ringing peals of machinery hard at work competed with the tech priest's songs. The servants of Call set out from the hangar, leading them into a gargantuan smeltery. Temperature indicators within Messinius's sensorium rose, and the noise of creation came from every quarter. A cacophony of roars, whooshing hot metal, clangs and banging that made any conversation impossible. If Guilliman said anything to either ck3 or to Colquan, it was inaudible. The smelter's noise would have overcome a conversation shouted directly into Messinius's ears, and the next chamber was no better. There, a mass of fully automated devices assembled parts of machines in looped production lines. Many different processes seemed to be underway in there, with multiple tracks running in, over, and through each other to maximize space. They crawled up the walls, over the ceiling, exiting and re-emerging through tight apertures set into the fabricatory's walls. He tried to calculate how many worlds must have been bled dry to make the Zarquisitor. Dozens, he decided. A succession of factory spaces came and went. The party headed downwards the entire time. Eventually, the last fabricatory was behind them, and they passed into the first of a series of immense storage holes. The temperature dropped rapidly. Most of the cargo was concealed in plain transit containers. Auger readings became more uncertain the further Messinius went from his ship, and he got no definitive information on what was in the containers, but equally he got no impression Call was trying to prevent data scrying. Then they came to areas where the contents were on open display, and Messinius found himself amazed. There was hold after hold of tanks, battle walkers, aircraft, and void fighters, all of unfamiliar new designs. His battleplate rapidly scanned them for combat capabilities, flashing hints of unknown technologies across his helm plate. All were obviously intended for the Adeptus Astartes. He was still trying to evaluate the equipment when they went into another hold, and further wonders were revealed. Thousands of suits of power armor waited for wearers in silent ranks, their plates part wrapped in protective films, hanging from padded armatures in racks dozens of layers high. He looked on astounded. This too was brand new, innovative technology. Power armor was precious, hard to fabricate, the pieces often passed down from bearer to bearer and embellished by each man to wear it. This was all pristine, entirely uniform, and heavier than the war gear Messinius was used to. The other Space Marines were similarly affected, though they held Vox silence as the Primarch had bidden. The silence in the holds was complete, and though their ears still rang from the noise in the fabricatories, the humans lowered their voices instinctively, as if they were in a temple, but they murmured and spoke rapidly with one another at each new revelation. "This is Adeptus Astartes' power armor," they were saying, "but who will wear it?" Messinius thought the same. There were not enough Space Marines in the whole galaxy to fill all this armor, not anymore. What was the point of it? It was then Guilliman spoke. His face remained stern and lips unmoving, but he sub-vocalized a message to them. "My sons, my brothers," he voxed them. "There is something I have been keeping from you. Do not judge me harshly for it. The time of revelation is at hand." The final door opened, and Messinius understood. Chapter 16. The Primaris Revelation. Alpha Primus. A new age dawns. The procession came to a massive lenticular space deep in the ship, the largest hold of all, emerging through a triple set of armored gates onto a viewing gallery. Guilliman and his transhumans were taken to the railings at the front. The rest of the groups were ushered onto raised platforms, placed so that all might see down onto the hold's floor. Messinius went to the front with the Primarch. 100 feet below, a clear square near the gallery was illuminated by bright light, its source unseen to the observers, and within it stood 100 Space Marines clad in unmarked grey armor. The rest of the location was black as old night, but the size of it could be sensed. Messinius' systems estimated it to be miles across. As well as being the largest chamber they'd seen in the Zarquesitor, it was the coldest, and the human's breath rose in clouds around them. He looked down at Call's creations. They were bigger than him, a new kind of Space Marine. As inconceivable as that was, they were there, in front of him. He began running threat assessments. A lone blaring horn wailed across the space, and a single grav platform descended from overhead. From the delegate's perspective, it came top down, rotating at the midpoint before continuing until it was level with the Primarch at the front of the viewing gallery. A pair of giant vid screens floated up to hover beside it. These activated to show the occupant of the platform, greatly magnified. A massively augmented tech Magos stood before them. His upper torso supported a number of additional limbs, but he was otherwise recognizably humanoid, with a human head beneath a high hood where patches of age-blue skin were visible between his augmetics. Though hidden by a large augmetic mandible, his face seemed to be of flesh, and a cunning human eye shone deep in his hood next to a bulky augmetic. These scraps of flesh aside, he was mostly machine. His belly and back were bulked out by massive plates covered in empty input sockets. A high crest was locked over his bent spine, with much machinery beneath the rear, and the whole studded with large sockets to take additional limbs. His lower portions bore no resemblance to a normal man whatsoever. Multiple legs bore him on a long carriage that was sufficiently large to allow him to look Rabute Guilliman dead in the eye. Archmagos Belisarius Call, self-proclaimed greatest mind of the age and prime conduit of the Omnissiah. He carried no weapons, and his form was slenderer than the last time Messinius had seen him, lacking the armor plates and other artifacts of war he had carried on the Terran Crusade. Call was in every way a Martian grotesque, yet when he spoke, he had a cheerful, warm manner.
"Greetings, dignitaries of the Imperium," he proclaimed.
His voice was amplified and boomed at godlike volume through the chamber. He spread his arms and bowed, the various mechadendrites and other tentacular appendages he wore rising over him in a fan.
"And greetings to you, Lord Rabute Guilliman, creation of the Omnissiah, most holy representative of him, and my friend."
He pointed meaningfully at the Primarch. He bowed again at Guilliman alone, then rose and extended an arm behind him to indicate the square of silent Space Marines. Under the brilliant light, the metal of the Magos' hand shone like quicksilver.
"For those of you who do not know me, I am the Archmagos Belisarius Call. 10,000 years ago, the very same Primarch who stands with you today entrusted me with a great and difficult task.
the improvement of the work of the Omnissiah himself. A murmur passed around the crowd, loudest among those knots of people with technical knowledge or an understanding of the Martian cult. You have passed through this ship of mine and seen some of my work. Improvements to weaponry, armor, and attack vehicles. Salvaged ancient knowledge and entirely new designs. The scale of what I have achieved in armaments and war gear exceeds the wildest dreams of my colleagues, but it is the lesser part of the work. These warriors you see here before you, you are the crowning achievement of my project. You bear witness to a new founding, he said, joyfully. A new kind of warrior, the Primaris Space Marine. He chuckled, a most incongruous sound. Do not think me a heretic for my presumption, for the Lord Gilliman commissioned me to undertake this task. Even I do not have the temerity to tinker with the Omnissiah's work without permission. It was Lord Gilliman that gave me access to what few records and materials appertaining to the Space Marine's creation survived the Great Heresy War, including the remnants left from his original Primarch project. May the machine god ever guide and watch over his incarnate component. In a few moments, you will see that although my labors were millennia long, understanding even the work of the Emperor himself was not beyond my genius, and I have exceeded the Primarch's demands in every way. He clicked metallic fingers. The warriors in the square divided immediately into squads and began marching around. Stronger, more durable, more intelligent, more loyal. In the Primaris Space Marines, I have perfected that which many already thought perfect, correcting flaws and introducing new enhancements to further improve combat effectiveness. Cole gave another chuckle and bowed modestly. There are those in the priesthood that would burn me for my claims, but I speak only the truth. I do not mean to call my work better than that of the Emperor, or to suggest my own substantial skills exceed his. These things I have done are rooted firmly in all the Omnissiah did before me. For is that not the driving force of our creed of Mars, to look back to greatness and through diligent study recreate it? I stand upon titanic shoulders in order to touch the stars. He snapped his fingers again. Holes opened in the floor. From them issued dozens of heavy combat servitors. The Space Marines stopped marching, set down their guns, and drew their combat knives. This demonstration you are about to see is at full lethality, he said. These servitors are among the very best combat models available. I know, for I made them myself, and they have been programmed to kill. I shall transmit their combat programs to you all for full disclosure. You may deconstruct them at your leisure. There will be no falsehood. I come to purvey hope. I am no bringer of lies. His mouth was invisible behind his mandibular augmetic, but they could all hear the smile in his voice. There is no point selling you the excellence of my wares if you do not get to see them fight. Here is a little demonstration. He clapped his hands. The light snapped off the Magos, shifting the focus of the group onto the Space Marines in the square. They readied themselves as the servitors fanned out into attack formation. Unlike the Space Marines, the servitors sported a full array of ranged and close melee weapons, which they leveled at their foes. Grey faces mounted with advanced targeting augmetics stared across at warriors encased in power armor. Both sides were as inhuman as each other in their own way. For a moment, the opposing forces faced one another. "For the Emperor!" the Space Marines shouted, their battle cry amplified by their helmet augmenters into a roaring shockwave of sound. Even in the expansive hold, it was startling, and many of the full humans flinched. The square erupted into violence. The Space Marines charged. The servitors opened fire with high-energy weaponry. An energy field contained the battleground, and it sparked with stray hits as plasma streams connected with it. Messinius watched as one of the Space Marines was felled mid-run, a coruscating beam of particles melting through his chest plate and burning out the flesh inside with a shocking intensity. Call was killing them to make a point, and he could not agree with that. He glanced at Gilliman, but the Primarch remained impassive as ever. Another was hit, and although his armor was breached, he kept his feet and charged forward again. The servitors managed only a couple of volleys before the Space Marines were among them. The crash of ceramite on plasteel echoed up from the illuminated square. The aggression they displayed was terrifying, all the more so for being completely controlled. They targeted the ranged servitors first, wrenching their guns off their mounts before murdering their organic components with chilling efficiency. Aside from that opening cry, the Space Marines made no noise as they fought. Metal crashed. Oil mingled with blood in broad slicks. Machines and men died. Messinius watched 3 Space Marines take on a 6-limbed monstrosity whose arms were tipped with crackling power blades. The Primaris warriors were fast, stronger than Space Marines of his type, and taller. His sensorium passed as much information about their war gear to him as it could gather. The reactors were more powerful, their guns bigger and better. Without a full Auspex reading, he could tell little more, but he could see. These were not Space Marines. They were something else. They were his replacements. He realized as he watched that he was witness to the dawning of a new breed, and by extension, the end of his own. One of the Primaris Marines was cleaved down, his armor split in a flash and bang of disruptor charge. The others moved around the whirling blades. They were ungraceful, and to Messinius's practiced eye they appeared stiff, almost a little mechanical, but the economy of their movements was astounding. Within 2 heartbeats they were within the reach of the combat servitor and set about the joints of its limbs, slashing pipes and power feeds with their knives. Hydraulic fluid sprayed out, and its arms went limp. In the space of only a few seconds, they had brought low a mechanical horror. As Messinius watched the melee progress, he felt a tingle in the back of his neck. He turned around, expecting to find someone staring at him from the windows in the wall behind. He saw nothing, but his suspicions were raised. Messinius was far too experienced to ignore instinct. He voxed Tyrannus, the senior Victrix guard present. "Watch the Primarch," he said. "There is somebody here that shouldn't be." Messinius left the clamour of combat behind, passing the enraptured delegations of Terran power to an open doorway, where he entered a plain corridor lit by dim blue lumens. He looked one way, but his attention was dragged to the other, and he felt himself drawn away to the right. The corridor opened up onto a set of stairs in a square well set in the wall of the hold. He allowed his feet to carry him up 3 floors. Again he turned right, allowing intuition to guide him. He had the sense of a presence awaiting him. A psyker, perhaps. He loosened his bolt pistol in its holster, but did not draw it. He came to a room with a round-cornered window looking out over the display ground. There were pallets ranged about the room, their loads covered over by heavy plastic tarpaulins, heat-sealed to the bottoms. Dockets, written in the indecipherable script of the lingua technis, occupied clear wallets on the outside of each. In that lonely place, a giant stood. There was no light in the room, but that shining in from the hold and its display ground, only enough to highlight the many scars covering his face. He was Adeptus Astartes, Messinius was sure, but bigger even than the other Primaris Space Marines fighting for their lives in the square. He could be nothing else. Enormous muscles bulged under his robes, his milky skin was darkened in patches by the black carapace, and armor interface ports were visible in the back of his neck and wrists. "Good day," the figure said. He kept his eyes on the melee. His face was half turned into the room, allowing Messinius to see his expression. It was indescribably miserable. Messinius felt enormous pity for him, without knowing why. "Who are you?" Messinius said. He put his hand on his pistol. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," said the man. "Then why did you call me here? You are a psyker, yes?" The Space Marine turned fully to face him. He had full, downturned lips and sorrowful eyes. "You felt the manipulation. That is interesting. You must have some sensitivity to the warp." "I'm no witch," said Messinius. The Space Marine stared at him. "If you say so." His doleful gaze flicked down to Messinius's sidearm. "You won't need that. I am loyal to the throne. I am no threat to the Primarch. I called to you, to warn you, in fact." "You are a psyker," said Messinius. "One I did not expect to find, and one I was not informed of. You are a threat." He held his ground by the door. This was a powerful warrior. He primed an emergency message pulse. "Yes, I am a psyker, among other things, said the warrior. But I assure you, I am not a threat. Who are you? Messinius asked again. I do not have a name as such, but my master calls me Alpha Primus. He looked down at Call, half hidden in the darkness. His little joke, he said bitterly. The Archmagos likes to joke. Messinius remained wary of this Primus, but he did not feel threatened, and went to stand beside him to look into the square. The fight was nearly done. Most of the combat units were down, scattered about in a mess of shattered machine parts and rent flesh. Half a dozen of the Space Marines were dead, another several injured. That is a waste, a needless cruelty, he said, hoping to draw a reaction from the strange Space Marine. He got a question back in return. Is it either of those things? Said Primus. A few lives to show the Primarch's newfound power. A little display to inform those who might oppose him of the violence he could unleash. That is worth a little blood, do you not think? The Primarch would not stand for such wanton murder. Not if he had to do it himself, but he can see the utility of this display, said Primus. My master likes his shows. He likes surprise. Gilliman has not been aboard this ship before. He looked at Messinius. You know him. I sense it. Do you think your precious Primarch will not have anticipated this display? He let it happen because it is expedient. He is using it, just as he is using his surprise at the scale of Call's achievements to distance himself from the Primaris's creation, thus blunting suspicion that he intends to usurp his father. There is never an opportunity missed with Rabute Gilliman. He is a masterwork, said Primus, with a mixture of envy and appreciation. He looked down on the Primarch. He placed his hand flat on the glass. Such majesty the Emperor engineered into the Primarchs, whereas I am an abomination made by a second-rate tinkerer. His hand fell from the window. What do you think of your replacements? Messinius said nothing. You will not speak? Fine. I sense your surprise, though. Gilliman did not tell you of the Primaris project? No, admitted Messinius. He probably told no one at all, said Primus. How does that make you feel? Messinius questioned the wisdom of answering honestly, but did so anyway. It offends me that I was not trusted. But I see why he told no one. A Primarch with a new breed of Space Marines available soon after he awakens. Many great men of terror remember the heresy. To a suspicious mind, it might look like he planned this. It does it not? Primus nodded. Nobody is ever truly open, not even your gene-father. If I may offer you some advice, do not believe everything Call tells you when you speak with him either. He overplays his genius. He walks a crooked path. This is your warning? Messinius looked into Primus's scarred face. It is. You do not need to warn me of that. He made you? Primus nodded. Palpable misery wept off him. What are you? Are you one of these Primaris Space Marines? Primus returned his sad gaze to the battle floor. He moved slowly, as if every motion cost him an enormous effort. I am different to them. I am different to everyone. The Archmagos says I was the first of the Primaris Brotherhood, but I do not think this is true. I can do things none of them can. I was there before they were made. I have watched them grow in number. I have guarded them down the millennia. I was here long before the first of them was awoken to be tested. Why did you really call me? To warn you, and the giant shrugged. Boredom, loneliness, but mostly to warn you. He took a weary breath. To each of his sons the Emperor gave some of his gifts. I doubt any one being other than he could contain such power in its entirety. To each of the sons of those sons, a portion of those gifts were passed on in turn.
I have several of these gifts, as many as Cole dared give me. I have called to you, Captain Messinius, to show you myself. I am living proof that Cole cannot be trusted."
He turned his ponderous head back to the demonstration below. The Space Marines were lined up for inspection, while the dead combat units were cleared away. They were powerful, a decisive force for the man that controlled them.
"Do not fear," said Primus, giving Messinius the certainty he had read his mind. "Cole has no desire to rule. He wants what we all want."
"What is that?"
"The salvation of mankind."
Primus took a slow breath.
"But Cole is not infallible. He believes he is, but he is not. He sees himself as the instrument of his God, the Omnissiah, your Emperor. You know, I see so much. When I look beyond this crude reality, I see him burning in the fire of his beacon, eternally writhing in pain. Gods do not suffer, so he cannot be a god. That is my understanding of it. Ergo, Cole's basic understanding of the universe is flawed, and that means he is wrong."
He was quiet a moment.
"Or maybe it is I who am wrong. Perhaps he could not see the truth and remain unchanged either. Perhaps he is divine."
He shrugged.
"What does it matter?"
Beneath them, Cole was gesticulating with all the fluid enthusiasm of a huckster. His presentation was becoming more energetic. Without the accompanying speech, it looked almost comical. It made him appear even more dangerous somehow.
"Great forces gather," said Primus. "For millennia, the Imperium has had no one to lead it. At last, mankind has someone to believe in, and they do believe. They believe so much it moves the warp. This is a source of alarm to many, many beings, from politicians to gods. Be careful, Vitrian Messinius. The Primarch has legions of enemies, and they are yours now, too."
"I have faith in my Primarch," said Messinius firmly. "I have no fear." Primus smiled sorrowfully.
"Be wary of faith also, Captain. It will destroy us all one day."
"Faith," he said, pointing to Guilliman.
"And hubris,"
he continued, pointing to Cole. He curled his finger back in.
"I have said what I needed to say. I would return now if I were you. Cole is reaching his grand finale. I do not think you want to miss it."
Messinius glanced back at the illuminated square. Blackness stretched away in all directions around it. What did it hide? Finale. When he looked up, he was alone. Primus was gone. Unnerved, he took himself back down to the display hall, voxing his troopers and ordering them to perform a sweep, knowing already they would find nothing. Messinius hurried back to the display stand. Space Marines were moving out of the back of the hall into the galleries. The Victrix Guard had taken up combat stance. Guilliman seemed to pay no attention, but Messinius could see he was ready to fight if he had to. As he passed through the stands of dignitaries, he noted well their reactions. In some, he saw hope of a new weapon that might deliver humanity from its imminent doom. In others, he saw consternation. He shared it. New warriors ready to fight from cold caskets. They must have been hypno-indoctrinated to make them so effective. If so, what else might have been put into their heads? Tainted chapter culture was readily passed on in this manner, and Messinius was fully aware of what thoughts an ambitious man might program into new warriors. He returned to his place as Cole was finishing a lengthy description of the Primaris Space Marines' capabilities, and gave details of the weapons and armor they had, making sure to impress upon the delegation that this was only the tip of the sword he had forged, and making equally sure to state his loyalty to the Imperium. He was garrulous, an unusual trait in the Martian of his exalted rank. More unusually, he seemed eager to please. These characteristics more than surprised Messinius. He found them disappointing. Cole was contemptible, but did that make him more or less trustworthy? Given Primus's existence, he thought the latter. Finally, Cole stopped prattling and bowed, retreating a little upon his grav platform. A silent Rabute Gilliman looked over the company of identical warriors standing to attention. Call had not revealed which Primarch was their father. Another troubling note.
"You have excelled yourself," said Gilliman. "I am at a loss for words."
"I had 10,000 years, my lord Rabute," Call said. "Maybe I got a little carried away."
"I expected a better breed of warrior, better weapons. Everything I have seen since I awoke has shown me nothing but decline. This is—"
Gilliman paused.
"Something new," said Call, nodding his head in satisfaction. "I am an innovator. Many of the others call me heretic for this, but I am what none of them are. I am a scientist," he said, using a word of ancient origin rarely spoken in those times. "They use that as a slur, but I am a true servant of the machine god. I study the work of the Emperor closely. I use the ancient arts of deductive reasoning. This is no heresy. Indeed, I say more honor is given the machine god by using his tools properly and not falling prey to the dogma of rapturous unenlightenment."
"You have given me an army,"
said Gilliman. Call turned suddenly, rising up on his mechapedal carriage and spreading all his limbs wide.
"Army?"
he said, cranking up the amplification of his voice so that it rolled around the hold like thunder. He laughed.
"An army? My lord, I have given you legions."
He gestured. The dark parts of the hold suddenly filled with paired points of light. Thousands upon thousands of active eye lenses.
"Behold," Call cried, "the true extent of my genius."
Squares of light came on, each accompanied by a resounding boom. They started slowly, emanating from the display ground, illuminating the entire grid of the hold, both floor and ceiling. The lights came on with greater speed, until the whole space, more than 3 miles across, was brightly lit. Under glaring phosphor glow stood thousands of Primaris Space Marines. The gravity plating above the delegation was inverted, and as many warriors were arrayed on the ceiling as there were on the nominal floor. They were divided by gene line. Unlike the unliveried initial 100, these were dressed in the yellow of the Imperial Fists, the blue of the Ultramarines, the grey of the Space Wolves, the red of the Blood Angels, the black of the Raven Guard and the Iron Hands, the vibrant green of the Salamanders, the darker green of the Dark Angels, and the White Scars. Within each block were multiple armor variants, infiltrators, terror troops, reconnaissance specialists, heavy shock troopers, and others. New patterns of dreadnought and piloted walkers stood behind them, and when Call clashed his metal hands together again, lines of grav tanks fired their engines and rose from the deck in humming formations. The Space Marines brought their weapons across their chests, new patterns of bolt, plasma, and every other kind of gun besides, and stamped their feet twice, shaking the ship.
"For the Emperor! For terror! For unity! For Gilliman!"
They roared as one. Call's voice rose triumphantly, and his legs pushed him higher.
"Not since the time your father walked among us have so many Space Marines drawn breath. They say I blaspheme. They say that I tinker with the work of the Omnissiah in ignorance. It is they who are ignorant. I, Belisarius Call, am the only one with the wit to follow the Emperor's original vision."
He sank down again and lowered his voice, clasping his hands in front of himself humbly.
"But I can only accomplish part of it. I am not the Emperor, and nor are you, my lord. He made his armies, and he conquered with them, but to do what he did requires both of us. So in honest humility, I relinquish these warriors. All these warriors, every one, every gun, every tank, every void ship, every suit of armor, and every bolt to your command."
Gilliman looked down again at the host, multiplying the contingent by the Zarquasitor's numerous holds. Call watched him, a sly look on his aged face.
"I calculate there to be 24,000 Space Marines here. Are there more?" said Gilliman eventually. "These are not all?"
"All! All!"
Call laughed uproariously, 3 voices emerging from his voxmeter, layered over one another.
This is only the tip of the proverbial iceberg, my dear Robute.
Call was habitually overly familiar with the Primarch. His lack of respect annoyed Messinius and strengthened his doubts.
The ships I brought with me contain 5,000 warriors each, all currently asleep, Call went on. Upon Mars many times these numbers still slumber, and in other places. I was careful to cache them away, you see. Some envy me so much, they want me dead, and all my works burned. Can you believe that?
He affected a wounded air.
These here are merely my demonstration models, enough to make a sufficient impact, I hope, on you and my esteemed lords of terror. Enough to begin your war, but I assure you, I also have enough that you might finish it.
Guilliman looked upon the Archmagos again.
How many are there? He asked.
With great relish, Belisarius Call told him. In that moment, the history of the galaxy changed forever. Guilliman looked around the hold. For the first time, Messinius saw him surprised, genuinely so, and yet he knew Primus was right. Guilliman had expected this and had factored it into his calculations. He was using his own emotions for political gain.
You have served the Emperor like few ever have, Belisarius Call.
Guilliman turned to face the delegation.
This is what I brought you to see, my lords. This culmination of orders given 10 millennia ago and exceeded in every way. Not since the Great Crusade has such a force been available to us. The Emperor had a dream, he said, to unite all mankind in peace and prosperity, to ensure every human being could live a life unspoiled by the fear of Xenos oppression or the thirsts of dark gods.
He glanced down.
I have lived twice. In my first life, I was naive. I did not see what the universe truly was, that this realm of matter we inhabit is but a part of things, not everything, that the wars of the spirit are as important as the wars of flesh and blood. I have paid for that ignorance many times over. It was a residue of that ignorance that led me to preserve what little we could salvage from the wreck of the Horus heresy, rather than tasking my brothers with making something new. I returned to find my efforts were insufficient, and that humanity suffers because of my lack. For that, I beg your humble forgiveness. I swear to you all, here and now, that I shall atone for those errors, that I shall put right my mistakes. Now is not the time to dwell on what has been lost, or what might have been, or yearn for what we briefly touched in those times you call the days of wonder. The time has come not for preservation, but for advancement of the human cause. No longer shall we live like frightened rats in a crumbling museum. An age of terror has descended, a night to rival the terrors of the age of strife. But there is light in the darkness. We shall prevail. We shall push back the dark and retake from it what is rightfully ours, not from yesterday, or 10 years ago, or 1,000, or even from the time your emperor walked among you, but before, when humanity ruled the galaxy, in the high ages of technology, and all feared us. When there was peace and prosperity, it is this I shall restore. As the Emperor almost succeeded in doing, we, together, you and I, shall once again try, and we shall succeed.
He flung out his arm towards Call's Primaris warriors.
Terror has its armies. Our fleets gather. Let the enemies of the Imperium quail. The days of darkness are over. The reconquest of the galaxy can begin.
Chapter 17. Data Mine. 3 errors rectified. A way out revealed. Nora was hungry. Taking the side route had been a mistake. It split and became so tangled that she was rapidly lost. What looked to take her up led her down. What should have led her forward led her back. She spent a night hiding in an abandoned room, and in the morning had stolen food and water from a small refectory between shift sittings, but that had been hours ago. Her mouth was parched, her stomach ached. She was clueless as to where she was, finding herself moving further and further away from populated zones until she was wandering silent corridors made narrow by tall shelves. An unaccountable number of vellum and paper scrolls stretched away until they vanished into the distance, all grey with age. The corridor was unusually well lit, with functioning lumens hanging from the apex of the ribbed roof, but there was no one about. She had been hoping this corridor would lead her back to the main route, but the longer she stayed on it, the less sure she became, until she was certain she was going the wrong way altogether. She stopped and looked back the way she had come. It seemed as long as the way ahead. She made a determined noise, clutched the Emperor's idol in her hand, and continued the way she was going. A couple of hours later, the corridor vanished into an immense hall that stretched on out of sight. Towering piles of papers heaped up seemingly without care took the place of the shelving. Her footsteps slowed as she came into this landscape of waste, and she faltered. It was cold there. Despair stole up on her, accompanied by exhaustion. She hunted about for somewhere to rest. "I'll go back," she said. "I'll just retrace my steps until I find someone to show me the way. Perhaps the blockade will be gone by now." She was fooling herself. In any case, she hadn't got far enough to claim the rights of a scribum errant. She'd be caught and just be sent back. There didn't seem to be anywhere safe in the hall either. She could hear things scratching about, and there were chewed scraps of vellum everywhere. Rats, she was sure. Her father used to say they got as long as your arm down in the deeper places. She didn't like her father and had barely known him before she was sent away, but she remembered that. It had scared her so much. As sleep was about to claim her, she found a tunnel burrowed into one of the giant piles. It was made by people, not rodents, because it was big enough to stand in, albeit stooped. She went in a short way and saw she was right, for the tunnel was held up with props made from broken-up scroll shelves, and rats didn't do that. There was a neat pile of more stacked by the door, making her think someone might come back. Would they help her, she wondered. They might at least have some food. "Hello," she called into the tunnel. The compressed vellum made her solid material, but soft enough to swallow her voice whole. She went further in and found a bowl candlestick with the stub of a candle still in it. It was covered in dust. Her spirits sank. It didn't look like anyone had been in there for a long time after all. The tunnel sloped up into the dark. There was no sign of any rats so far as she could tell. She was past caring anyway. She was so tired. So she lay down on the compacted scrolls. It was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Within seconds, she was fast asleep.
"Hey! Hey, you! Wake up! Hey!"
A bony hand grabbed at Nora's shoulder, scratching her skin through her shift. She woke to a head-mounted stab light full in her face, unable to see who the hand belonged to.
"This is my claim,"
the man said. He held a short-hafted pitchfork threateningly in one hand, ready to stab down at her.
"What are you doing here? This is mine."
She pushed herself back up the tunnel on her elbows. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I was only looking for somewhere to sleep. I'm lost. I'm lost. Please." The light bent towards her, and she held up her hand against it. The man who wore it sniffed at her. He said suspiciously.
"You don't smell like an excavator."
The pitchfork wavered a little. I'm not even an archivist. I'm from the Spire, Departamento Processium Quinta."
"The spire? You're in the tower."
"I know," she said. The stab light withdrew. The man pulled it from his head and set it down. She blinked after images away until she could see him clearly. He was old and ill-kempt, with black teeth in a hole of a mouth thatched with a straggly beard. The skin around his eyes was wrinkled from squinting, and his expression hovered over the uncertain ground somewhere between kindliness and madness.
"You're a long way from home,"
he said.
"A very long way from home."
"I'm trying to get up Hive. I got lost. There was a roadblock."
"Yes, everywhere. Big things happening outside the Plea District. War is on Terra. Other things happening too, so the whispers say."
"War?" she said.
"Yes, war, fighting, bad things."
His eyes darted over her appraisingly. He reached out a hand to touch her. She slapped it without thinking, and he drew it away sharply.
"Ow!"
he said.
"Why did you do that? Only sin if you was real."
he moaned, and flapped his stinging fingers about.
See ghosts down here? All sorts.
I don't like being poured at, she said. Why are you here?
I'm an excavator, a data miner. All these scrolls, millions of them, some thousands of years old. They keep it cool so they don't rot. Important part of the process, my job.
Why? She said.
Don't you know? He said.
He blinked and sat back on his heels.
This is the plea processing district. The missive hive, the archivist tower, the processing halls, all of it. Thousands of messages every day come in here. The receivers read them. The rankers rank them. The higher-ups action them. Or not, he said, pointing upwards and behind him. The records end up down here for a while, but...
He leaned closer suddenly, his dirt-seamed face eager.
But they don't always get it right. Sometimes they make mistakes. If I find an error, I get rewarded. That's why I'm mining this heap. Most of these are only a few hundred years old.
He slapped the wall of compressed messages.
Still current. If I find a misfiled text, I can take it to the administrator and get a bounty. Double if it leads to a prosecution according to the Lex Minoris. I've had 3, he said proudly. 3 silly scribes gone to the pyres for making a mistake, and so they should go. What would the Emperor think? He tutted. Very bad business.
3? In your entire life?
Not in anyone else's lifetime, is it? He snapped. 3 in 32 years is good going, I tell you. And if you leave off the 5 years of my childhood before I started work, it's even more impressive. I'm a real finder, me. And now I've found you.
He licked his lips and looked at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. I can earn you some money, she said, heading off any other ideas he might have. His eyes refocused, and he looked up sharply.
Money?
I've come here to see my father, she said. I was bartered from the Departamento Gradio to the Departamento Procession. He's still here, I hope, she added quietly.
Why do you want to see him?
He's my father, she said.
Most irregular,
said the man, unconvinced. He'll pay you. He has a good ancestral office.
Then why are you a processor and not a ranker?
She looked down. Her eyes went moist, and she blinked back tears. I was his 7th child. There was nothing for me back home. All our hereditary offices were filled.
Ha! Said the man. Then why will he pay me?
Because he will, said Nora. The man flinched. Look, you know your way around the tower. The man nodded.
Yes, I do.
Then what will it cost you? A day grubbing through this? She patted the compacted vellum. Surely an uncertain reward for something you already have is better than a certain reward for something you probably won't find. He looked thoughtful.
Maybe.
His eyes were sharp.
What if it takes longer than a day?
It won't. It took less than that for me to be taken to the spire, and we went on foot. I'll bet you know a much quicker way too.
I do, he said. Where are we going?
My father's name is Hamron Nissen. He dwells within the halls of post-classification, the pre-ranking division.
Aha!
Said the man, and capered about.
Not far at all. Let's go.
Not yet, she said. Do you have anything to eat and drink? The man scowled.
You want feeding too?
You won't get anything if I starve, she said. He saw the logic in that, and scuttled crabwise from the tunnel, returning a moment later with small pieces of dried meat that could only have come from rats, and a bottle of blessedly pure water. She took both and gulped them down. Now, I'm ready, she said. The data miner's name was Teasel, and he led her out of the hall through a door she would never have found. She shuddered as she considered what would have happened to her if they had not met. She'd either have been lost down there forever, or gone back and got swept up by the literati. The door took them to a stair that climbed for many levels before they even saw another door. Teasel ignored this and continued on for what seemed like hours. They took the next and went through work galleries that reminded her of the cubicularium in the numbers of people employed there, but were otherwise completely different. Miles and miles of cabinets, acres of shelves, fields of data input terminals manned by file serfs sporting bulky augmetics. Nobody stopped her or asked her what she was doing. They were all far too busy, and the worst she suffered were sharp looks and shouted rebukes when she got in their way. Where the cubicularium was silent, these places echoed with counter-check songs and requests. Trolleys piloted by servitor torsos rumbled past, piled high with scrolls, and towing trains of carts sided with wire grills carrying more. The higher they went, the better the air became. The people looked a little healthier, and their robes cleaner. Eventually, they came to the level of the middling adepts, the domain of her father. Threadbare carpets covered over the plascrete floor there, and more than half the lumens worked. The adepts she saw were well fed, some even looked well rested, and none of them had the haunted look of dehydration that plagued the lower workers. Gallery after gallery of office doors, all numbered and named with stenciled characters, rolled by. Peons rushed about self-importantly. The ceiling was a tangle of pneumatic tubes where document cases sped in rattling trains. Nora squinted at the doors until they reached one bearing her father's name and number. "Hamran Nissen," she said, grabbing Teasel, who showed no sign of stopping. He looked back and peered at the door. He smiled his black-toothed smile.
"This is it?"
"Yes," she said.
"I'll be right out,"
he said, walking in without knocking, leaving Nora in the corridor on her own. An adept in training hurried by. The tubes continued to clatter. A few minutes later, Teasel came out. He looked happy.
"You can go in now,"
he said, and held the door open for her. Nora had been 6 years old when she'd been traded off to the Processian clan, the standard age to commence work in the hive. She had never visited her father's office. She barely remembered him, but as soon as she saw him, she recognized him. He was older and had become a little fat, though the Emperor alone knew how. His workplace was a surprise to her, being more luxurious than Overwatcher Jedman's lair, and oppressively bright. Circumstances conspired to discomfort her, and matters got worse from there.
"Ah, Nora, so it is you," he said. "I'd recognize that miserable face anywhere. 14 years gone by or not."
He laced his hands together. He did not look pleased.
"What by the 9 devils of Horus are you doing here?"
Nora's newfound sense of adventure evaporated, and she became timid.
"No answer? I had to pay that wretch too. Do you realize how difficult it is for a man of my position to get hold of money? I can't just throw it around, you know."
She did not think it could be that difficult. Her father's office was finally appointed.
"You were sent to the missive processors. You are supposed to stay there. What will your workmaster say? What will your husband say?"
She shuffled her feet. "I don't have a husband," she said. Hamran groaned loudly and rubbed his hands over his face.
"That's the whole bloody point, sending you to another clan so you can get a good position and a suitable mate. You'll be telling me you're stuck in a cubicle still."
Her throat was closing up with the shame of it, so she simply nodded.
"Empress teeth girl, you always were useless. Do you think they'll trade any more ink and power for wives if none of them will take you? What are you now, 19?
He swore colourfully.
"Practically too old. Bastard missive shufflers." He shook his head. "You can't trust them. This isn't the first time I've heard of something like this. But my daughter, unmarried. Do they know who they're dealing with?"
His outrage was purely for himself. Her feelings didn't come into the equation. Hamran pushed himself away from his desk and went to a sideboard where a bottle of downhive spirit stood. He poured himself a generous measure into a cracked glass and slurped it down. He did not offer her any.
"You can't just run away when things aren't going well," he said. "The Emperor has his plan for all of us. By denying it, you are at the risk of heresy, and will all be held accountable."
"But that's it," she said. "You always told me that we are all soldiers in the Emperor's wars."
"We are."
"That's why I'm here," she said. With shaking hands, she took out the folded missive from her robes and handed it to him. "Because of this." His eyes widened.
"What are you doing with that?" he said. "You can't have this. Not here. It's in completely the wrong place. I can only see this if it has passed through the correct channels."
He took it anyway and read it and frowned.
"Why this missive? No, this won't do," he said. "It won't do at all."
Father, please listen to me. The Emperor sees us all, and we do his holy work. That's what I'm doing now." Something in her tone made him look at her properly. She was always a resource to him. He had never looked at her like she was a person, not until then. Into that tiny moment she leapt, breathlessly telling him of the tarot spread and how it came to be laid and why she feared it to be important. Luckily, her father was a devout man, even if he had many failings, and he listened. "I need a shortcut," she said. "I think someone needs to see this. It's important. I just have to get far enough that I can claim scribum errant status, that's all." He tapped the vellum with his fingernails. Maybe. He breathed in sharply through his teeth. "Those bastards in the Departamento Processium tolerate us because we are necessary, an earlier link in the chain, as it were. I'm tired of them looking down on us all the bloody time." He went back to his desk, turned round and ran his finger down a rack of small, neatly labelled boxes behind. He opened one, pulled out a form, and scratched a message and his signature on it. "We'll say it's a misfiling," he said, appending the slip to the message with his seal. "If you are challenged, say that you came to me because you had no choice. If there are any repercussions, it'll serve those tedious pedants on the other side of the chasm right for reneging on our marriage arrangement. You're going to have to go beyond this spire cluster, get to the final appraisal department. There are adepts there high up enough to make a proper decision on this. There's one I hear who is particularly lenient when it comes to irregularities. Make sure he does his job right, rather than letting the job do him. More fool he, I say, but this is his officio designation." He scrawled it down onto another piece of paper. Nora read her father's writing. The ink ran down the paper, but remained legible. 1/8923 FG4, it read. "Make sure you tell him everything you told me." "Spire cluster," she said. "What do you mean?" He looked up sharply. "No education either?" She shook her head. That particularly outraged him. "Those swine! Heads will roll for this. I will see to it personally." He went so far as to wag his finger. Then he opened another drawer. "Get that scroll grubber to take you. I'll bet he knows the way. Scum like that always know things they shouldn't." He fished out a small bag of coins and handed it over with the document. "Emperor go with you, child. With a bit of luck and his guidance, we can make those short-sighted ink sniffers suffer a bit." The idea jollied him. "Ha!" he pronounced. "Thank you, Father," she said. Yes. Now go away," he said, dismissing her as he would any one of his minions. "Nora," said her father. "Yes, Father." She turned back, hopeful of a morsel of approval. "I never want to see you again," he said. "Don't come back here." Chapter 18.